wetlands. A little bit of time after Kevin is done talking about where we're at with the RFP. The RFP's closing on Friday, as most people know, and then we'll talk about the process of getting from that date to the next steering committee meeting date, which is unknown at this moment.
But likely mid-February and likely in Bismarck.
So we can talk about that in a little bit. Kevin, I think what I'll do here is see if I can find you online. I think all you need to do now, Kevin, is click on that share your desktop, and you can take it from here. Okay. It seems okay. Can you guys see my desktop? It's coming in slowly. I wonder if that's a bandwidth issue. I see 3 beautiful kids.
Yeah, I'm up.
Okay, so it seems like there's a timeline. I'm going to flip the slide right now. Tell me how long it takes to change.
Just went to slide 2.
Okay, that's pretty fast. All right, I just wanted to make sure that we kind of had all that in mind. Okay, well, this is a project that you all funded, I think a year ago, I guess. And it started off with a meeting up in the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture in Saskatoon, Canada. And we were all lamenting that we've talked about the need for cross-border conservation planning tools for tons of years, as in the 2005 implementation plan for the joint venture, but we haven't made any progress on it. And at that time, we sort of committed to start thinking about it, and that's kind of where it started. Then when the LCC started getting going in earnest, we said, you know, maybe we can put a grant in for this, and this might be what would sort of jumpstart this effort. And we did, and we got it, and I'm going to talk about that today. I've been coordinating this project, but really a lot of the heavy lifting was done by Adam Reba, Aaron Smith, Susan Witherly, and Kaylin from Ducks Unlimited and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So some of the technical GIS questions I simply don't have the answer to. I'm not sure if Adam's on the phone, but if he is, he might be able to answer them. And then Johan and Kaylin have done a lot of the statistics. So I know the premise of most of it, but there might be some questions that I don't have full answer. So the big question is, you know, why do we care? Why do we even start this project? We have our own independent systems within joint ventures. And the big thing that came out of that meeting in Saskatoon was climate change is really operating at very large regional scales. And we know from just science in general that you need to ask questions at the scale that the drivers are operating, or you're unlikely to find the answers that you want. And so if we want to understand how the whole system is moving and shifting, we need tools that operate over the entire system. As I was talking about right now, even going back to, it was written in the 2005 plan, which means it's been, you know, even going down to 2000, people have been talking about having cross-border conservation planning tools, but we simply haven't done it yet. The last thing for the PPPLCC is the PPR is incredibly variable. Neil Neiman's paper looking at the wetland conditions was a prime example of that for me. And you know, at some point you can have booms and busts, but they're rarely happening across the whole PPR. And so if you want to understand how the system functions as a whole, how much redundancy we need to build in our conservation planning systems, you need to have models that understand the full system. Okay, so the premise was pretty simple. Take existing habitat layers, build them into a large geodatabase so they all are on the same grid. They can talk to each other, they can snap together, and so they can use them for spatial modeling. A lot of these things have their own accuracy assessments with them already, but none of them have really been looked at in a cross-border fashion. So, for example, you look at the NAWMP modus, there's a lot of papers on the accuracies or non-accuracies of that, which you can just basically read from the scientific literature. Same thing with NLCD, they produce their own accuracy assessments. But what we're really worried about is are they consistent? Because if we wanted to have a conservation planning tool that's spanning the borders, what we need to know is if we're having a variable that's about 30% grass in the United States, is it roughly about 30% grass in Canada? I mean, how do the wetland areas relate to each other? If you say there's 3% wetland here, does it equate to roughly 3% of wetlands in Canada? So we needed to understand if there's systematic biases within the system that could basically change some of your ecological conclusions. What we ended up doing is we combined classes into 5 main cover types. The main reason we did this is, one is there is just the cover types in Canada were not as split up as they were in the U.S. And the other thing is looking at NLCD and doing some accuracy assessments here at the HAPET offices. Some of the classes, like if you're going from hay to grassland, when we had accuracy assessment on some independent data, and it's really a flip of coins between those classes. So the sensors really weren't good enough to differentiate if it's a hay pasture or if it's native grass, but they can tell you that it's grass. And so for certain species, like a Sprague's pipit, that might be really important to you. In LCD, what we have here probably isn't going to be the tool for it, depending on how it works. But for other species, it might actually work. So it kind of is what it is. We got the tools that we got and we put them together, and in the end, I'm going to sort of walk you through a little bit of duck modeling. We're already seeing that they can be used fairly well to model species. Okay, one thing that we knew before we even started this project was that the Canadian version of NWI was going to be biased low for small wetland counts and the area of wetlands within a 4 square mile area. Work from the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture has already shown that from their spatial modeling. They have a SPATS program that looks at waterfowl nest success and whatnot. So this is an issue that's known. But what they did is they actually developed, they used generalized linear models to build correction factors based upon precipitation regimes, soil types, land cover, and a whole host of other variables that actually correct the counts in areas of these wetlands within a 4 square mile area. So I don't know if Dave Howard is on the phone or not, but the intricacies of their model corrections, I don't have that. That would be Ducks Unlimited Canada folks, but they've known that was a problem. They basically corrected it, and they've been using their layers for their own conservation planning tools for.
I think Kevin, I am on the line, and yeah, the key point here was that the CanVec is widely available, but we knew there were problems with it. To try and correct that, we had certain areas where we had wetlands delineated using very high resolution imagery, and then we used GLMs, as Kevin said, to correct for those areas where we didn't have the high resolution imagery.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Okay, so really what we ended up doing is what I would call consistency analysis. Accuracy assessment, right? What we wanted to know is, like you said, if you're talking about 30% grass in Canada, that's roughly equal to the same thing down in the States. We tested these predictions at a 4 square mile area, and we had 90 reference sample plots in which we went in and classified the satellite imagery from high resolution stuff. We basically tested 3 models to figure out how consistent the habitat layers were predicting each other. So model 1 is effectively, you're just regressing the percent. Your Y variable is going to be your reference data, that's going to be percent grass or wetland area or whatever. And then you can regress what you get from your 4 square mile area. And ultimately, if there's no differences between the country, you're going to have the same slope and no intercept. There's not going to be a blocking variable for country. Model 2 is basically saying, same thing, you're regressing your reference data versus what our habitat database is saying. But then we're allowing it to have a country intercept adjustment. If this model comes in, what it tells you is you're basically seeing the same biological relationship, the same slopes, but the mean values between the different countries are different. So I hope that that's kind of clear to folks. The third model we tested is that there's different slopes and there's different intercepts. And so what this means is that the relationship between different variables, they can change at different points in their density. So if you're talking about low wetland densities, you might have one relationship between U.S. and Canada. If you're at high wetland densities, you can have a different relationship. Obviously, N1's ideal, N2 works, M3 you'd have to be very careful with and understand a little bit more about what you're doing with those variables. What we found is across the board, most of the habitat variables, the second model had the most support in information theoretic framework, meaning that the slope and the relationship between our reference data and the predictions in the U.S. and Canada were consistent, but the means were different, and that you needed a more like the country blocking variable if you want to use these variables in habitat modeling. You can kind of see two of them, the other non-habitat class and wetland count. Those, the best model had an interaction term, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in detail a little bit later. Like I said, the majority had consistent slopes, but you need intercept adjustment. So this is a picture of wetland area across the PHJV and the PPJV. Eventually, we will have the wetland data for the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture as well. But some of the NWI basin process isn't completed, so it hasn't been included in this project. And if you kind of look, you know, right there's a thick line, but actually, if I even make a really thin line there, just the spatial pattern that you see when you look across the country, it's pretty consistent. It looks really, really good. This is what I'm talking about where you need an intercept adjustment. So what we did here is we plotted basically for the mean wetland area across our 90 reference plots, and we said we have our regression equations, and we said, okay, what are the predictions in Canada? What are their confidence intervals? And what you can kind of see is in Canada there's a higher prediction than in the U.S., but and I don't have a figure of this. If you actually looked at the regression relationship and you looked at, 10 wetland area, hectares per 4 square mile up to a higher range, we see two parallel lines following each other, meaning that they're consistent, but that you have to, again, control for that country intercept. Grassland area, you had the same thing. This layer was even, I'd say, better than the wetlands as far as if you look at the patterns as they track across the border, they're spatially very consistent. The slope of the regression was again exactly the same, but we saw the same thing, which is you're going to need to have a blocking variable for country to use these. And as you can imagine on this one, if Canada's a little high and the U.S. is a little low, I didn't show a figure of this, but if you look at cropland inverse of grassland in the system, U.S. overpredicts a little bit, and again, in our reference plots in Canada. Okay, so getting on to Model 3, and this is where we had the interaction term, and what this is telling you is that the relationship's not consistent across the entire range of data that we observed. So that has a country blocking variable, and then it has an interaction term on the slope of the regression for the habitat variable. The other habitat class, I'm not getting in all, there's going to be a report that has a lot of the sort of dirty details in this one, but if you look at those regression lines of sort of plotting it between the lower bounds of what we observed to the higher bounds, it was a very inconsistent relationship. And bottom line is we wouldn't use it for anything. That particular class, there's a little quadratic sort of function at the top of it. It didn't make any sense to us as to what would be causing this. So right now, our recommendation would be to not use that. When we plotted the wetland count data, if you actually plot the lines, what you're going to see is they are fairly similar, but in the lower range versus the higher range, there's a little bit of difference in how the two variables relate to each other. And so what we did here is we're doing the same thing. We're taking our regression predictions. We're at the minimum value, the maximum value, and the median. And what we're seeing is that the difference between U.S. and Canada, the directional is consistent. Canada always is predicting more in the wetland counts with the correction databases they have up there. But the difference is at height, the maximum count is, or the median, it's not following a straight linear pattern. So what that means to me is that if you're going to use these variables, which we still think you can, you're going to need an intercept adjustment or a random effects type model, or you're going to have to use a nonlinear model that can account for the fact that the relationship changes at different ranges that you observe. Okay. The bottom line is, what we're finding right now is they're appropriate for regional scale analyses except other habitat. And why we say regional scale is, and I think, again, anyone who's worked with NLCD in the States or the Canadian data up north will know is, if you're talking about, a 100-meter area and how accurate you're going to be, it's really, these layers aren't that great. Then you start getting into townships. They're pretty darn good. You start getting in North Dakota PPJV. They start to be very accurate. You start going across the entire PPJV and you want to understand big distances and distribution across those kind of extents. They're going to be very accurate. So it's going to be scale dependent as far as how useful these are or not to you. Most folks on the call are probably going to know that if they've worked with NLCD before. All variables are going to need a country blocking variable. I say that without a doubt. Wetland count, that's what I was kind of talking about before. You're going to need an interaction term or random effect, more likely than not. And if you use a nonlinear method, then you need a node split for country. So I didn't want to get into too much of the heavy details, but just to say that it's there. Once the PPPLCC has their website up, it's going to be posted on that. Anyone can download it. And then there's going to be a full report for folks that want to dig into a little bit more of the details of how the consistency analysis is done, if you can use it, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch gears and just kind of show how we had some pilot models up and running and show you how it can be used and applied. But this might be a good question. If there's sort of questions first about the database, I could stop here, field those, and then show you how we used it. Or if not, then I can just show you how we used it.
Yeah, I might mention, Kevin, you referenced the data sharing site. That's going to be LC-MAP. Some of you may have heard a presentation on LC-MAP a few months ago by the folks at the Great Northern LCC. We'll link to it from our other website as well, but that'll be hopefully up and running here in the next few weeks.
Any other questions out there?
Kevin and Zan, I just had a quick question regarding using the 2001 NLCD layer versus the newer version, the 2006. Can you just explain why you guys chose to use the 2001 version?
Well, I mean, 2006 could get pieced in. We used 2001 because it's consistent with what the Canadian data.
Okay.
So that was the reason. And shortly we're also going to have one of 2012 NLCD. But days on the phone, I don't know if Canada's planning on updating their habitat layers anytime soon.
I'm not actually sure what the plans are. There's continually talk of that, but to date there hasn't been a very regular schedule, so I'm not sure what the next scheduled update is.
Gotcha. So that's why, and I think right now, we kind of built a system that can be used, and it can also be updated as things move forward. But for what we were talking about and the rates of conversion and whatnot, we were basically saying, we should probably have a standard benchmark date so we're not hopefully introducing too many biases into our planning tool.
Okay.
other questions for Kevin? All right. Well, I'll just quickly show you some of the preliminary stuff we've used this habitat database for. Again, the PPJV, the PHJV wanted to have a conservation planning tool at first for waterfowl, but ultimately for a lot of different grassland species. This is our first crack at it. Largely the same folks involved in the sort of database project, although we've added a person from the Nature Conservancy, Jeff Evans, to help with some of this coding. So what we did is we used a nonlinear technique called random forest as the modeling basis for this waterfowl project. Ultimately, we're going to look and compare this to GLM-type models similar to what the PHJV has done. But we just wanted to start with something that's sort of fast, easy, and can handle some of these nonlinear predictions, or it could be nonlinear ecological properties in something this large. Mainly because of just the size and the ecology of the ecosystem. It's obviously the whole PPR is huge. What we modeled was the 5 most common species of dabblers. The sampling unit was a segment level 4 square mile area, and ultimately we can put these into the database too if folks want. There's a few other things, climatic variables that we included in this project as well. That wasn't part of our LCC project, but they're all on the same grid system, and we can put it on the database for the PPPLCC as well. So we had, minus the one that talks about, we had average growing days, average precipitation, and spring-summer precipitation balance, or some other climatic variables that we had. So every year, Fish and Wildlife Service and its partners fly these large transects over a lot of this country to set the waterfowl regulations. They've been doing this since the 50s. And what we did is we took the data from 2000 and forward and used that as our basis for modeling for this prototype. The reason we did that is because that's when we switched over to more of a GPS system, and so we felt the data would be a little bit more accurate. And it's also about the time frame that most came online, and we wanted to use some of those metrics as well. So we took those the centroids from those aerial surveys, we linked them to the population databases. You can see that picture on the right. Larger dots equate to larger waterfowl populations. Now my computer's locked up. We're just going to sit on this page for a moment. There we go. And what we found is when we looked at the population count, we were predicting between 60 to 76% of the variation in the population count. It was dependent. The climate variables came very strongly into a lot of the models. And right now we're just modeling all species combined. And we felt that if we did individual species models, it could improve the prediction. Another thing is when we actually built out these spatial models and then compared them to what the more or less sample theory would estimate, we were getting very similar population estimates within a transect. So we're able to not only have a different way of estimating the data, we're getting similar population estimates, but you're able to partition those populations through space based upon the climatic variables and also the habitat layers that I'm talking about. That country effect is going to be visible in certain years, even if you have a node. 2010, and a node, again, that's one of those things at random forest where it's splitting the partition for why ducks would settle in a particular area, and the node specifically I'm talking about is U.S. or Canada. In 2010, the PPR down in the Dakotas was exceptionally wet, and our populations were basically food and bread for that. At the same time, it was fairly dry up in Canada. And even if we haven't tried an interaction term and that kind of stuff, but at that sort of, the birds were down here in such force in those given years, it's hard for the models to have the full range of variation to actually generate the right correction. So you're going to have to be cognizant of it. But again, right now we're just in pilot models, and we haven't worked through all the different runs to see what this is really going to look like when it's done. What we found is the spatial predictions were very reasonable, and again, our population estimates were very similar to what the migrant folks would be estimating. In random forest modeling, you get these things called model improvement ratios, and they more or less look at variable importance. And not surprising for ducks, pond counts and moisture were pretty important. The land cover and topography were not as much. Okay, so this is just a picture of what it can do. Is you get the spatial population model, you have the counts, you link it to the habitat, what you end up with is spatial predictions of where the ducks are settling within a given year. And the thing that's kind of cool once we finish this project is you're going to kind of get that window through time, and you're going to see more or less what's the mean and standard deviation and how these ducks settle, so we can kind of inform our conservation planning strategies to figure out, does an area always consistently have waterfowl? You know, obviously the most important area for conservation is going to be very high population numbers and low variability. That means that they're going to consistently hold a lot of ducks. Then you're going to have your explosion type areas that you get out in Alberta. Ultimately, the knowledge of that will help us plan a little bit better. Right now, you can kind of see that the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture in Minnesota are not included in the modeling. But when we get the wetland data finished for the NWI, we plan on using the same techniques for the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture. And also, we plan on talking with the folks in Minnesota and getting their population data, because they've actually flown this very similar service to what the Fish and Wildlife has done for a long time. Iowa, there is no data down there except for what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks do for the forest month. Just a picture of the population model, and again, you can kind of see the larger dots equal bigger populations, the smaller dots equal where you would not expect to see them.
Hey, Kevin?
Yeah.
Did you advance your slides there?
Can you see it?
Oh, it just showed up. Okay.
Sorry, it seems like there's a time lag sometimes and not on others. And what's basically the bottom line is green's where we say they should be, and there's much more, the bigger dots are in the green areas. And the sort of light purple starts to get smaller. When you get the dark purple, we should say there's basically none. If you actually compare to what was counted in that year, there was very low numbers in the areas that we're saying that they shouldn't be. So where we're at is, it's pretty early to tell the full utility, but the prototypes are working exceptionally well. The species-specific models, we think that can improve our accuracy somewhat. The wetland data, so the count data is basically it's the basis, it's static, but we know that the prairies aren't static, and so there's going to be an ebb and flow of what's wet in a given year. We were able to use the actual count data from the aerial surveys to build sort of a wetland layer that accounts for how many wetlands are full within a given transect, that gives you a handle on how wet an area is. It would be nice if you had a system similar to what the Foursquare model has, where you can actually model that a little tighter. When looking at the motives, the NDWI, which is the normalized difference wetness indices or something like that, it effectively had no predictive power for waterfowl settling, which frankly makes me a little skeptical of the layer. However, there's folks at the YERC, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, it's like Yellowstone Ecosystem Research something. They're working on a percent surface water correction. We haven't tested that yet, but that might help us and others who are trying to do this. And again, understand the variation in breeding populations can help for conservation planning. So that's it in a nutshell. I guess from the duck perspective and how it relates to the column, the habitat layer is, it's pretty hard to explain 60 to 70% or 76% of a population count with habitat layers that aren't meaningful. So we're feeling pretty good about the habitat layers at large scales, and we're also feeling pretty good about that they're going to be useful for conservation planning.
So folks on the call, based on Kevin's real-world examples of how this information is assisting in modeling efforts, any additional questions for Kevin? Well, Kevin, I have to tell you that I thought that your project was terrific, and I heard somebody at a meeting the other day say partnerships are a lot like sharks. They have to be continually fed and moving forward, or they'll die. And I appreciate your feeding the shark this month with this information. If you, let's see, I think I can just grab this back and take it over from here. But if you have any questions and you didn't get a chance to ask Kevin, please contact him directly. And this one. Oh, maybe it says review on your desktop, Mike. Have you seen anything? I have. Okay. So the other topic that we wanted to talk about today, in addition to the presentation by Kevin, was where we're at in the RFP process and how we're going to proceed from here to get to the next steering committee meeting, which is tentatively scheduled, as Rick said earlier, perhaps in mid-February in association with the Wildlife Society in North Dakota. So, as I mentioned earlier, the RFP closes on December 7th, and I will say that the last month, up to the last couple of days, it's been pretty quiet for questions. We didn't have any participation in our two conference calls that we had scheduled through the grants.gov announcement. The last 2 years, we've had 20 to 30 people participate in each one of those calls, so that leaves me a little nervous about the numbers of folks who might have seen this announcement this year. But probably in the last 2 or 3 days, I've had a half a dozen calls now each day with people asking questions. And I think, Rick, you said you've had a couple as well in there. So folks are starting to get around to developing project proposals, and they're starting to reach out and get some clarification. So hopefully we'll have a pretty good list of those by the end of the week when the RFP closes. Hopefully, once our steering committee meets in mid-February, we'll be able to quickly let folks know whether they were successful or not in their proposals. And I think that now that we've had some familiarity with the new FBMS system, we should be able to cut contracts this year quicker than last. So one of the things we're going to try to do differently, this is a little challenging with Mike mentioned the new FBMS system. Our contracts folks in Minneapolis are going to try to take this information, because it's coming to them for the most part, and put it directly into FBMS, and then set up a SharePoint site that everybody on the tech team will get access to, so you can go right to the SharePoint site and find these proposals. Now that'll work for those who were able to access grants.gov, but we've already been called by several people, and they've said despite the fact that they've got all the appropriate clearances, they can't access grants.gov. For those, we will have to scan those and send them out to you via email. So just a reminder of one other topic that relates to the process this year. As we discussed on our last call, we have a funding tail of 6 projects this year that equate to about $850,000. We still believe that assuming we aren't going to have a dramatic impact from any looming fiscal cliff, that we should still have about $250,000 or perhaps a little more to spend on new proposals this year. Obviously, our funding tail in 2015 and 2014 is considerably less. $229,000 right now for 14 and only $75,000 commitments in 15. So this is the list of 9 ranking criteria that we've used in the past. And like we've done in the past, we've had a number of our technical teams that have stepped up and volunteered to assist in making some initial reviews.
so that the entire tech committee wasn't overly burdened with having to review 70 proposals or 60 proposals. We've tried to keep the full review by the technical committee to something around 15, and I think that will be the goal again this year. Depending upon how many we get in, this initial cut could be relatively quick, but these are the criteria that we propose to use to make those selections. And the last three on there, the cost-benefit, leveraging of existing work, and the redundancy of the work, was three that in the past, I guess it was last year, we decided would be secondary criteria that would be used in the case of close projects. If there were scores that were extremely close, we'd bring those last three in. Otherwise, we'll focus on the top 6 criteria. So we've got a little more defined perspectives on what these criteria mean, and I'll send this back out to the whole team. I've had a number of folks contact me, but if there's anybody on this call that would like to be part of the initial review team, I'll certainly take you up on that. I think right now I've heard from Jeff Stoner and Max, Rick, Ann, Steve Krenz, Justin Goody, but I know in the past Marissa and Mike Larson and Rex and others have stepped up and volunteered. So if there's some others on this call, or I'll put out a general announcement to the tech team that would like to step up and do some of the heavy lifting in this initial review, we're certainly willing to accept your volunteering on that. So thanks in advance for those that are willing to do that. So I guess where we'll leave it at this point is by next Wednesday, the 12th of December, Rick and I are at the Midwest meeting on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. We'll be back in the office on Wednesday. We should have a list of how many projects we got in through the grants.gov site and mailed directly to Rick and myself. And we'll send out a note to those who are on the initial cut team of how many proposals that need to be looked at to try and get down to 15 for the entire tech team to look at come mid-January. We hope to give the tech team at least 2 weeks to do the review of the final 15 and get them reviewed and ranked so that we can give the steering committee our recommendations approximately 2 weeks before they meet. So that's the goal and the process from here on out. Are there questions or comments on that? Any volunteers on the phone? Anybody on the phone? Okay. Well, I think we certainly have folks that have volunteered, and that may or may not be enough, but I'll certainly take any other folks that want to step up and assist this year. Just let me know. Do you have any other thoughts and comments? You mentioned Montana.
Couple of things, and this is a segue into this. Mike and I spent some time last week in Montana meeting with the state and World Wildlife Fund, and got some pretty good feedback on progress we're making in the partnership, and some pretty good information about kinds of things Mike just mentioned. So Montana had some good suggestions on processes for ensuring that the projects that we're funding in this partnership are really relevant. Justin's not on the phone. Really? Okay. And we'll share that information with you as well. But I guess I'd like to challenge you all to think very carefully about what Mike said in terms of how we're ranking and reviewing. Is there a way to improve this from what we did last year? From my perspective, I've been pushing our co-chairs really hard not to have the steering committee at the WAFA meeting in the first week in January, because I think we all agreed last year that the time we had to review these was not adequate enough to do a really good job. So between Christmas and New Year's, yeah. So I think where we're sitting now is I did a survey monkey with the steering committee, and 13 members out of 25 responded. 8 of those said they wanted to meet in Bismarck in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the North Dakota chapter of the Wildlife Society. So it's looking like we'll meet in February in Bismarck, and we heard from Montana, for example, and some of the rest of you might be in this position, personally as technical committee members, but also your steering committee members, they're just strapped for travel money. So I've talked to Tom Elias, who's, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service chair, co-chair, about potentially being able to cover travel expenses for steering committee members. And I kind of throw that same offer out to tech committee members. If you'd like to accompany your steering committee member to this meeting, because quite honestly, PPPLCC, work aside, the 50th anniversary meeting of the chapter is going to be a big one, and we're bringing in some pretty big outside speakers to be with us, and so I'm kind of inviting you to attend on our dime, if that's appropriate, and to participate not only in the steering committee discussions and be there for that, but also to participate in the chapter meeting. So I think we're set. We're probably set unless Tom and Terry decide something different to meet in February in Bismarck. I'll just share with you that one of the questions Tom asked me was whether the state directors were likely to come to Bismarck versus going to Tucson. And of course the answer is, who would want to go to Bismarck in February when he could go to Tucson in January? But I think he's okay with us doing it in Bismarck. And we'll set it up via webinar conference call like we always do. So he is cognizant also of the fact that the tech committee members are very strongly in favor of more time for a better review process. So think about how we might improve what we did over last year for this year as well as when you're thinking about this stuff.
One last comment. If you looked at the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC website recently, there is a new link on there to the World Wildlife Fund's most recent newsletter, and in particular a new planning tool that they've developed that we'll hear more about next month as we share information. And Anne, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am.
And would you like to give us a teaser about the tool that's been developed?
Hello. It's an interactive web map that we developed with an independent contractor here in Bozeman. Basically to serve a bunch of data sets that cover as much as possible the entire northern Great Plains as we define it. So kind of the western half of the LCC's ecoregion to a variety of groups that we're working with, most of whom don't have a lot of GIS capacity. So I'll just be running through kind of what our thinking was there and what we've included and why, and different ways of using the tool.
That's great, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about that. And we got a little brief show of that last week when we were in Bozeman. Max, are you still with us on the phone?
Yeah.
Any update on where we're at with the workshop and continuing to edit the report?
Well, I haven't received any comments back from anybody. And I am actually, if you remember, we left the last workshop as basically kind of hanging. We needed to continue to work on the prototype decision model that we built there in Bismarck, and I'm actually working on that right now. We were planning to have something to go back to the tech committee to talk about by probably the end of December, beginning of January.
Okay. And in addition, I'll put in a shameless plug for your oil and gas workshop coming up in mid-December. I know you've got a lot of irons in the fire. That one's particularly of interest to the LCC, so thanks for doing that as well.
No problem. And Max, remind us when that workshop is being held, please. That is being held December 19th.
At the North Dakota Game and Fish Office, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
Well, one other thing I'll share with all of you that we'll alert you to when this comes out, but in the budgeting for LCCs from a national perspective, our Washington office always does what we call holdback funding, and there will be another RFP coming out this year like last year where Washington is looking for projects that cross LCC boundaries, that help build a network together. And several of those were funded last year, and you can find that information on the service's website. We'll send you a link if you're interested. But just a heads up that there's another opportunity coming up for us in this LCC and other LCCs to start talking about projects that truly do cross boundaries in our inter-LCC in nature. One of those that's in the works right now, Justin's familiar with it if he is on the phone, maybe Ann is a little bit, but there's 4 LCCs that have sage grouse, and there was $1 million allocated for work on sage grouse this year. There'll be an RFP coming out for that shortly, and we'll let everybody know when that's coming out as well.
Thanks, Rick, for the update. Anybody else on the phone have any information for the good of the order for the LCC? All right, thanks again, Kevin, for the information and for providing the food for the shark this month. With that, I guess we will reconvene January 2nd for those who've stepped up and volunteered to help with the initial review of the projects that are coming in. I will be in contact with you via email here in the next few days. Thanks again, folks, and if I don't talk to you before the first of the year, have a terrific Christmas. Bye.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks, you too. Bye.